Some classes of steam locomotives have had at least one or more of its members stand out from the rest in the days of steam, and that example might even be around today. But it's natural with preservation for not all members of that class to avoid being scrapped. Now imagine a class with one or more survivors, but then you learn about a member that, let's say, made a speed record, or pulled a special train, or did something else, but that member is not a surviving example, or in other English, got scrapped. We all may take note of a class with surviving examples, but would have also liked to have seen a particular non-survivor also be preserved too. If I were to talk about non-survivors from classes with no surviving examples, that would be just the same as talking about extinct steam locomotive classes, so those won't be included. This list is like an extinct steam locomotives list, but instead I'm talking about a non-surviving member or two from a class that has at least one surviving member for each pick. With all that on mind, these are 10 non-surviving locomotives from preserved classes of steam locomotives. Number 10. Pennsylvania number 7002. I know what you have on mind. That looks like 7002. It's definitely the real engine. But the truth is, that 7002 in the picture is not the real 7002, but instead one of her sister engines in disguise as 7002. Let me explain. The real 7002 was an E7 class Atlantic built by the Pennsylvania Railroad's Altoona Works in 1902, at which point the larger 462 Pacific type was starting to replace the 442, making the E7 some of the youngest Atlantics in America. As it is known to many of us, in 1905, the 7002 reached a max speed record of 115 miles per hour, making it the fastest steam locomotive in the world until the Germans stole the crown in 1936. Spoiler alert, their engine is on the list too. Now, granted, the 7002 was claimed to have went 127 miles per hour near the city of Elda, Ohio, but this record was only based upon two passing times recorded by separate observers at two different points just 3 miles apart, and it was difficult to, or I dare to say, impossible to indicate the train speed from the signal box registers, therefore making this record debunked. I also get fed up about this claim sometimes because how the heck could an Atlantic that old hit that kind of speed on level track, and without any streamlining? Anyway, the 115 mile per hour record isn't debunked, still therefore giving some historical significance to the locomotive. Yet despite the historical significance from the 115 mile per hour record, the real 7002 ended up getting scrapped anyway. In the aftermath of the real 7002's demise, one of her sister engines, E2A number 8263, was upgraded to an E7 in 1916 and eventually renumbered as 7002, as well as being modified to look like the real 7002 for the 1939 New York World Fair, and was eventually retired at some point earlier or later that year. It also made an appearance at the Chicago Railroad Fair from 1948 to 1949. The 8263 ended up continuing the remainder of its career disguised as 7002, being transferred to the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in December 1979, then running an excursion service on the Strasburg Railroad from 1982 to 1989, and then being returned back to the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania afterward, where it resides today. So that 7002 may look like the real one, but in reality, it is actually the 8263 in disguise as the real 7002 because the real 7002 was scrapped. I would have liked to have seen the real 7002 to also be preserved as well. And the fact that I get fed up about that debunked speed record ended up making me put this engine one spot lower than the next engine which shares a similar story. Number 9. Canadian National K5A number 5700. Same reason as the 7002. Looks like the real locomotive, but it's actually one of its classmates disguised as that locomotive because the real one got scrapped. The real 5700 was the first of just 5 K5A Hudsons built for the CN by Montreal Locomotive Works in 1930. Unlike the Canadian Pacific, the Canadian National Railway wasn't crazy about the 464 Hudson types and only bought 484s from that point on. These locomotives performed well with short trains, but when traffic grew beyond 9 cars, they could not handle the fast schedule required, thus why they were replaced by 484 Northerns and reassigned to the Toronto, London, Sarina/Windsor service. Despite the CN not being fond of Hudsons like the CP, the last K5A wasn't retired until 1967, about 5 years after the last major American railroads had given up steam. When the K5As were sent for scrap, the Canadian National had decided to preserve the class leader, number 5700. But sadly, there was seemingly a communication issue, and the 5700 had been cut up before they could save it. Fortunately, 2 K5As are still around today, those being number 5702 from the Canadian Railway Museum in St. Constant, Quebec, and 5703. In response to the real 5700's demise, the 5703 took on the guise of 5700 and is now on display at the Elgin County Railway Museum in St. Thomas, Ontario. So this segment is mainly about the real 5700, which is not around today. Hopefully the rest of my picks will make sense for the idea of this top 10 list. Number 8. Union Pacific Heavy Challenger number 3967. Built by Alco in 1942, the 3967 was one of 20 locomotives from the Union Pacific's 1942 batch of Challengers. In 1953, the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club sponsored the Union Pacific with a rail trip from Denver, Colorado to Laramie, Wyoming, and over the UP's Sherman Hill during the return. This event is significant because it was the first Union Pacific steam excursion. The UP selected Heavy Challenger number 3967 for this trip, which became a good call when considering that the Challengers and Big Boys were in fact built for Sherman Hill. After the excursion, the 3967 continued its career with the Union Pacific until its retirement in 1957. But unlike fellow classmates number 3977 and 3985, which were saved from being scrapped, the 3967 instead became among 103 Union Pacific Challengers to be scrapped after the railroad dieselized. UP temporarily resurfaced the 3967's legacy for the 40th and 50th anniversary of the excursion in 1993 and 2003 respectively by having the then active 3985 masquerade as the 3967 and perform the same run that the now extinct 3967 did decades before it. Spoiler alert for my top 5 retired US steam excursion stars video, I did forget to include the info of 3967's historical significance when I told the story of 3985, and I am sorry for not including it in that video. 3977 and 3985 are also the only preserved Challengers or Force 664 locomotives in the world. But it can't hurt to save a third Challenger, maybe 3967 for the sake of the excursion. Number 7. Grand Trunk Western number 5629. Built by Alco in 1924, the 5629 was purchased by Richard Jensen in 1959 and returned to active service under his ownership in 1961. He used the locomotive on a few excursions on the Grand Trunk Western system in the Chicago area, and from 1967 to 69, it saw service on the Schlitz Circus train out of Baraboo, Wisconsin. But at some point in the 1970s, Jensen broke his back from a fridge accident, rendering him unable to afford any more excursions. After having the 5629 moved around for some time, it was stored in the Rock Island's Blue Island Yard south of Chicago in 1987. But after the Rock Island right-of-way was abandoned, the Blue Island Yard was sold to Metra, who decided to redesign the property to meet other needs. Metra asked Jensen to move his locomotive, but was unwilling to assist him in moving it, since it was owned by Jensen, and therefore they couldn't move it, otherwise they'd have to scrap it. After several groups, including the Illinois Railway Museum, tried to get their hands on the 5629 and move it without Jensen's approval, Metra had had enough. The railroad sent out a salvage group and scrapped the locomotive right where it stood. Despite the efforts of numerous groups to save it, the 5629 would have suffered this fate anyway had it not been for Jensen's early intervention. Congratulations, Metra.
I'll kill you! I'll kill all of you! All of you will die! You'll get like that!
You too, Jensen. She's gone and infamous for this. Along with you too, Metra, which I super hate now. unfortunately, two other Grand Trunk Western Pacifics, number 5632 and 5030, are still around to preserve the 5629's legacy. Number 6. Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy number 5632. This 05 class Northern was built at the railroad's own shops in 1940 and was used on both freight and passenger trains, typical of the Northern type. Following its withdrawal in the 1950s, the CB&Q's president, Harry C. Murphy, saved the 5632 from scrapped and had the railroad restore it to operation for excursion service with the railroad steam program. The restoration was finished in 1958, and the locomotive entered excursion service on large passenger trains solo, and occasionally ran double-headers with Mikado number 4960, that also being a CB&Q locomotive. On September 6 of 1959, during a doubleheader with Colorado type number 6315, the 210-4 lost both of its eccentric rods, but the 5632 saved the excursion by pushing the crippled 6315 in front and pulling the 18 cars behind them. RIP 6315. In 1964, the 5632 was painted gold for the centennial of the CB&Q's mainline and the 50th anniversary of the completion of Kansas City's Union Station. 5632 gained the title of the largest brass model in the world for both events, thus why I put it one spot ahead of 5629. Later that year, the 5632 was sent to the railroad's Burlington, Iowa shops as it was in need of an overhaul. A more thorough one than the last, I suppose. But this wasn't to be. Murphy stepped down as president, and his successor, Louis W. Mank, had no interest in running steam, and therefore ended the program. In response, this also halted the 5632's overhaul. Richard Jensen purchased the 5632 in September of 1965 and had it moved to the Chicago and Western Indiana's Roundhouse in Chicago, where he stored his equipment. That included Mikado 4960 and the infamous Grand Trunk Western 5629. But in 1969, the C&WI illegally sold the Northern and Mikado to a scrapyard in Chicago. While traversing the trackage into the yard, the 5632 derailed, and with no way to re-rail it, the scrappers just scrapped it on the spot.
No! No! Does not compute! Does not compute! Does not compute!
Okay, critic, chill. 5629 ultimately suffered the same fate 19 years later at the hands of Metra. But thankfully, 5632's legacy still lives, with 4 other CB&Q 05s still around today.